some things that I've been learning now. In the 90s, I was exposed to let's call it a healing circle. I heard dozens of individual stories about residential schools and about the traumas that people had experienced in those schools. We were dealing with people who had experienced serious trauma in those residential schools. The Alberni residential school was one of the worst in Canada for abuses. And as you may be able to imagine, those stories were horrifying. It's a windy day here. Shannon B. Douglas. I'm traveling across the country. I spent a few weeks in British Columbia, some time in Calgary. You may be getting some wind noise here from the microphone. I'm going to try and shelter just a little bit, but I don't know how well that's going to shelter. And this was a regular therapeutic life skills intensive workshop that ran once a month in Vancouver. It was run by a former business partner of Dr. Phil McGraw, and it helped people work through some life skills and some issues related to trauma and relationships and limiting beliefs and decisions. You know, the original Dr. Philisms were, how's it working for you so far? Okay. Now, because at that time, this was 1997, there was money available for people who had been in Indian residential schools for therapy and for working through some of this trauma that wasn't specified how it was spent. And about 40% of the participants in that group on a regular basis were from various nations in British Columbia. The Cowichan First Nation, Vancouver Island, the Chandaluth people from Port Alberni. We had Shuswap people from Kelowna, Kamloops Central Interior, and various other nations. Now, part of working through that life skills workshop was going through some of the stuff. Okay, so I heard directly, both in large groups format, in the sharing in this workshop, and in a small group, groups of 5 or 6 people, and in what they call dyads, so one-on-one. I will also say that, again, representative sample, that the people in that workshop, who the other 60% of people who were from various backgrounds and cultures, also had very difficult stories. And stories of incest, rape, abuse, physical abuse, psychological abuse were common as such that now, and after that workshop, and now 25 years later, when I look at people, I see and I believe that if you scratch the surface with most people, you will find hardship and difficulty. These are the things of life, okay? We all deal with these things, whether it's disease, could be abuse, could be family of origin, could be all kinds of challenges. I'm trying to block the wind on the microphone here so we're getting the sky. And the reason I say that, I don't want to minimize the stories of suffering in the Indian residential schools, because many, many people did suffer. And I'll share with you a little story and maybe some context for how some of these schools operated. In the 20th century, in remote Canada and in the north, it was very difficult to get children to schools. Where there were people working in mining camps and logging camps, where there were children. And we're talking about settlers and what we call colonialists or the colonialists, right? The settlers, the newcomers, the takers. Their children went to school with Indigenous people in residential schools. And because people were spread so far and thin even for children of families who were in places like logging camps and remote mining facilities, they lived in the residence at the schools. Now, at those schools, in many cases, there were people from the indigenous communities working in the schools. Okay? In some cases, 30-40% of the staff in those schools were from the indigenous communities. We have this representation that, because especially the narrative has included words like genocide, okay, and murder, and we have allegations of children being thrown into the coal ovens that heat the school and incinerated babies. That the schools were murderous, and that there was some sort of specific agenda to kill children. And I'm afraid to say, no, I'm not actually, that that's not the case. Those stories are distorted. Now, there are some questions, and even there is dissent within the community here at Cawasses First Nation about the nature of those grave sites, because the school was very much the center of the community. The chapels in these schools served as the parish for the community, for attendance of Christian church for everybody in the community. And in remote locations in Canada where there was a church, it was the center of activity in the community and the center of life. And attached to those churches, attached to the chapels on the same grounds, were very often cemeteries. I spent 10 years living in a small community in Quebec called Chelsea, and there are churches in Chelsea, and there is a cemetery in the churchyard. In the church that I went to when I lived here in Saskatchewan, north of Regina, near a town called Markinch, where we went to church every Sunday, there was a cemetery in the yard of the church. Not far away, a larger town, Southie, where my grandparents lived, there's a church with a graveyard in the church. So what we had with many of these residential schools was the school with a chapel that served a double purpose of being the school chapel as well as the community church. Now, many Indigenous people did adopt the Christian faith. My friend George Mann, who is a Nisga'a traditional carver and storyteller, is a very fierce and proud Christian. And in spite of the notion that we might have that this would have taken away from his religious beliefs and from his traditional beliefs, there are parallel structures between his tradition as a Nisga'a traditional storyteller and carver and the stories of Jesus and the parables in the Bible. There is overlap of wisdom between those traditions, and George has formed a type of syncretic sort of multi-language understanding of his spiritual practice, and uses a lot of Christian symbolism and analogy when he's talking, and to be honest, when we pray together. Now, my friend George Mann was a residential school survivor himself. He's my whack. He's my brother. He taught me that word in Nisga'a. And there's a whack is like big brother, but more like formal brother or bonded brother. And wacky is the name of little brother. It's a term of endearment. So George is my whack. And 18 of George's whacks from Nisga'a territory, from his community in the villages, have died by suicide, alcohol, or drug abuse after those residential schools. It's a very sad part of our history. And it's a very nuanced kind of conversation to be had. I don't believe personally that there was an agenda to abuse children. I don't believe that there was an agenda to molest children. I don't believe that there was an agenda to kill children in residential schools. There are documents surfacing, and again, there is dissent here within the Cawasses First Nation about these graves. Graves marked by wooden crosses a century ago no longer have wooden crosses. And graves in a community cemetery next to the chapel in the community that was the center and the heart of the community that are unmarked can't specifically be attributed to murders in residential school. It's quite possible there are children buried there. And there were rampant diseases. We had the pandemic of 1918, which killed people all over the world. We had tuberculosis. We had a high infant mortality rate, much higher a century ago than we do today. And it was a more accepted part of life. Death was a more accepted part of life than it is today. More on this in another video. My name is Shannon B. Douglas. This is While We Were Asleep.